Good evening, everyone. I know you have all battled traffic tonight. I hear that there's some people here from New Jersey, and we're delighted that they're here, and I'm sure other distances. Sorry we couldn't do much about the traffic. It's really very nice to have you all here tonight for this very special occasion. And I want to offer you all a very warm welcome. Tonight's lecture, Persian Women and Other Lies, Storytelling as Historical Retrieval, will be given in a few minutes by our distinguished guest, Dr. Bahiyyih Nakhjavani, whom I will introduce to you in a few minutes. But I want to bring to your attention that tonight's lecture would not have been possible without the influence of one of our distinguished scholars, Professor Farzaneh Milani, if I may ask her to please stand, who is in the audience. Yes. Professor Milani is the Raymond J. Nelson Professor and Chair of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Virginia. And truly, it's in large part due to her that we have this collaboration tonight with the University of Virginia. Thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge some students who are helping us tonight. They always help us with these events. They're called the BSOS ambassadors. BSOS stands for the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, where the Baha'i chair resides at the University of Maryland. And tonight we have 3 of them assisting us, and they do great work. They've been here for a couple of hours already, setting up the room and helping us with everything. We have, where are they? Mr. Javon Gord? Where is he? They're probably outside helping everyone. Miss Melva Coles and Miss Ozuchi Okorowoko. We very much appreciate their work and thank them for their service. So it is my pleasure now to introduce to you our eminent and erudite speaker, Dr. Nakhjavani. You've probably read that she grew up in Uganda, was educated in the United Kingdom and the United States, and there is a lot more between those lines that you could insert, but we'll save that for another time. Dr. Nakhjavani has lived and taught at universities in the Middle East, in Europe, Africa, North America, and has written several books and essays on children's education, the role of women, and the challenge of fundamentalism. In 2007, she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Liège in Belgium. Her most recent writing has been fiction, publishing 3 novels, The Saddlebag in 2000, Paper in 2004, and The Woman Who Read Too Much, originally published in 2007. Her novels have been published in French, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, German, Greek, Turkish, Hebrew, Russian, and Korean. Her latest novel, The Woman Who Read Too Much, is set in Persia in mid-19th century, in the world of Qajar monarchs, mayors, ministers, and mullahs. A recent issue of Kirkus Review, which is considered one of the most trusted and authoritative voices in book discovery, featured a starred review of Dr. Nakhjavani's book, and I'd like to read this wonderful review to you. In mid-19th century, a mid-19th century Persian poetess clashes against old world gender expectations, religious orthodoxy, and politics in this exquisite tale based on the actual life of poet and theologian Qurat'ul-Ain. I won't read the whole thing, but the review concludes that Nakhjavani deftly transforms an incomplete history into legend. An ambitious effort produces an expertly crafted epic. She has been praised in the Times Literary Supplement as a superb Persian novelist and the French translation of The Woman Who Read Too Much, was identified in 2007 as one of the best 3 books of the year. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I present to you Dr. Bahiyyih Nakhjavani.
Happy to see you all, and thank you very, very much for your efforts in fighting the traffic and coming all the way here. I do hope I don't disappoint you. I have to start, before I start my apologies, which I have a long list of those, but I have to begin with more thanks, maybe repeated thanks. But I'd really like to thank Professor Mahmoudi for having invited me. But above all, I want to thank yet again my precious friend Farzaneh Miloni from the University of Virginia, without whom I would not be here because there would be no book to talk about. And that is a fact. I'm not going to always give you facts tonight, because if I'm going to talk about Persian women and other lies, you can expect a few fictions there. But I have to confess that when I mentioned the title of this talk to some good friends, they became very worried. My father in particular, he said, "For God's sakes, don't say you're going to speak about lies in relation to Persian women. What will they think of us?" he said. So I apologize for the possible innuendos in my title. But the reason I chose that title, I hope, will become clear as we carry on. I really don't think I can begin without doing the third thing that everybody does at the beginning of any lecture. First they thank, then they apologize, then they offer you an anecdote, don't they? They always start with a date, and then they go on with a place, and then they usually bring some important event, and they introduce some fascinating individual who's going to change the world. So, of course, you're all expecting it. In the summer of 1848, in a remote province of Mazandaran in northern Persia, in a gathering of men only, a woman entered the scene with nothing at all on her face. You expected that. And that is possibly what most people think of and know when you mention the name of Tahir Qurat'ul-Ain. They think of that episode. But I have to add another anecdote. And this is in anticipation of a third. So my anecdotes this evening are going to be like Russian dolls. One is going to fit into the belly of another. And I have to start a little bit more recently. When I was a doctoral student and studying in the Amherst area, I went to a lecture that was going to be given at Smith College, and it was much advertised, and many people came, and we were all very eager to listen to the speaker, who was an unusual woman, very original. She had a Persian diplomatic father, she had an American blue-blooded Bostonian mother, and their marriage in 1904 was the very first marriage between an American and a Persian Baha'i. Her name, the woman who was the result of that conjunction, was Marzieh Gale. And everybody knew her as a very eloquent and intelligent woman, and she was an excellent translator, and we were just agog to hear what she had to say about Tahir Qurat'ul-Ain. So we all gathered together in this beautiful wood-paneled room in Smith College, and we waited, and we waited, and we waited far longer than you had to wait. 45 minutes we waited, and we began to give up. Where is Marzieh? She became a little eccentric in her old age. She finally showed up, about 45 minutes too late, wearing this enormous hat, a sort of My Fair Lady hat. She waltzed in, and in this very high, brittle voice, she began with the usual anecdote that we expected. In the summer of 1848, in a remote province in upstate New York, and all our jaws collectively dropped, and she started to tell the story of the conference of Seneca Falls, New York. And then she said, well, of course, you all know that story. But what I want to tell you is that 2 weeks before, in a remote province in Persia, the same summer, a woman walked into a public space with nothing at all on her face. And then she looked at us all from under the brim of that sexy hat and she said, I just came here to tell you that the Persian woman got there first. Well, the next doll in that series of anecdotes has to be added, because the last time I came to America myself, and this is part of the lies, I was invited to come and speak about a book which hadn't been published. And so I was being presented to the public as an author of something that nobody had read, nobody had seen, and might possibly have been imaginary. So I was invited by no one less than Farzaneh Milani to come also to the University of Maryland, where I spoke about something which didn't exist. And Farzaneh herself gave a most stunning talk on that occasion, and she brought those two events together, the conference at Seneca Falls and the conference in Badasht, the figure of Tahir Qurat'ul-Ain and the historic moment when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott introduced and really launched the beginning of women's suffrage in America. She made a magnificent speech which answered all the questions that Marzieh never addressed. She completed the lecture that Marzieh never gave. And for me, it was the absolute culmination of all the years that I had been thinking about this character, Tahir Qurat'ul-Ain, whose story is really going to touch us, not only because of the effect she had on the past, but because of the significance she has really for the future. I gather from having read the blurb, I think it was on here, or something else that you sent me, dear Huda, that you have been led to expect that this lecture will invoke the drama of sacrifice for the principles of justice, equality, and rights. Really? And I give you a title about Persian women and other lies? Well, maybe some of you have come here because of the lies. Maybe some of you are expecting something unusual about the Persian women. And maybe a few of you here may be expecting me to speak about principles of justice, equality, and rights relevant to the world today, it went on to say. And for that reason, I really am very embarrassed to continue. But the only justification I can have, really, is that of all the anecdotes I gave you, I hope you will see that this is not a lecture which is going to discuss with you the significance of Tahir's action or her words in terms of great high principles. I am not here to speak on that subject. I'm here very humbly to share with you the reasons why I did not write a biography, the reasons why I did not write a history about this remarkable woman, but that I chose to write a piece of fiction, which according to Puritan logic is truly a lie. So, I'm not even much of a truthful person myself, because although I'm Persian, I'm one of those Persians. When I was young, Persia was pink on the map. That's how perfidious Albion had placed it. And I don't even read and write in the right language, so I've written a book about a Persian woman in English, so that complicates it all the more. But nevertheless, the reason I did choose to write it as a fiction is possibly because of the multiple contradictions that Tahir herself contains. And I really couldn't carry on without just giving you a little glimpse of how I've introduced her myself in the book. So if you don't mind, I'll have a few moments where I read from the book, if that's okay for you. if I can find it. My cousin in LA told me, never quote from the book if you can't find the page. And it looks like I can't. So if I can't, then I can't. In that case, I won't. I will just talk to you about who she was. We don't really know very much about Tahira Qurat'ul-Ain as a character in history. Her date of birth is uncertain. We don't know whether it was 1817 or maybe 4 years earlier. Her place of burial is uncertain. We know it was in Tehran, somewhere underneath all the tarmac. We know it was in 1852 in the wake of the massacres that took place after the assassination attempt on the life of the Shah, but we don't know exactly when in the summer of 1852. We know that according to legend, and I use the word legend advisedly simply to insist, to emphasize the fact that when you hear about someone whose details of life you don't really know very well, we tend to gloss over the character and appearance of that person and turn them into a myth. And so according to legend, we hear that Tahira Qurat'ul-Ain was brilliant and beautiful. Now, what beautiful might have meant in Qajar, Iran, and what it might mean to you and me today is a very difficult thing to combine. We don't know what we meant by beautiful. Her own features are unknown to us. There is a poem in which she gives a little glimpse of herself with a beauty spot and the curls of her hair. But it's a very classic image which could have been applied to any idealized face of beauty. So who knows whether it was her. In medieval England, every woman who needed to be praised was described as having a high white forehead and grey eyes. So, you know, your guess is as good as mine. She was definitely brilliant, and the reason I say definitely is because her father chose to educate her as if she were a boy. Her father, who ultimately disagreed with her ideas, who argued with her, who debated with her, who begged her, who appealed to her to change her opinions. This man was aware that from a very early age he had a daughter who was so precocious, so intelligent, that he is said to have, I again repeat, said to have said, because these are anecdotes passed down through history. There was nobody taking notes on the occasion when he said it. He is said to have said that if only she had been a boy, she would have brought glory to my name. So if a man like that, from his background, was aware of her capacities, then she was obviously highly intelligent. We know also that she came from a very well-known, well-established ecclesiastic family in Qazvin, that her uncles, as well as her father, and that the women in her family also were artistic, were scholarly, were erudite. Her great-aunt or her aunt was a calligrapher in the court of Fath Ali Shah. Her own mother was highly well educated and literate. And in the city of Qazvin, there were colleges, there was a school established for the training, and the women in the family taught in that school. So this is a woman who comes from a family where both the parents, both the women and the men, were really unusual, were of a remarkable degree of intelligence and knowledge. So we also know that she herself was sent from Qazvin when she was married and her husband, her cousin, went to Karbala and Najaf. She also attended the colleges there, and we are told that she sat behind the curtain and listened to the debates going on, and that on several occasions she broke custom and decency and decorum by interrupting the discussions that were taking place among the ecclesiastics and clerics in the other room. So long before we have that iconic moment of her entrance into a public space without her veil on, she had already taken the veil, and Farzaneh speaks about this in her wonderful books, the two books in which she discusses the importance of Tahira Qurat'ul-Ain in the history of modern Persian literature by women. She speaks about the unveiling of her voice, which took place well before she unveiled her face. And we also know, finally, that she broke with all the customs of her family, her environment, her culture, and above all, her religion, by accepting the teachings of Ali Muhammad the Bab, by becoming a devoted follower of his cause, and ultimately, as a cause of that, she was killed in Tehran in the wake of the assassination attempt. But in spite of all that we've heard about her eloquence, her literacy, her ability to wield her pen as well as her voice, the fact that she was a poet, in spite of this, where are the writings of Tahra Qurat'ul-Ain? If we cannot put our finger on her person because it's so opaque and so uncertain, where do we find her in her writing? In order to try to give you a glimpse of how difficult it was really to come to grips with writing about this woman in a traditional historical way or in a biography, I want to read to you some of the words that describe the conditions of the writings that existed of the Babis at that time. Shoghi Effendi, who was really the chronicler not only of the past but also the future of the Baha'i faith, describes the early literature which was circulating among the Baha'is, the Babis of that period, in the following terms. He says, a narrow range of hurriedly transcribed, often corrupted, secretly circulated manuscripts, so furtively perused, so frequently effaced, and at times even eaten by the terrorized members of a proscribed sect. It's hardly surprising in such conditions that we have little that's left. And Professor Amin Banani, my dear, dear uncle, to whom I am forever grateful for having introduced me to Farzaneh, we have a legacy, you see. My uncle was Farzaneh's teacher, and Farzaneh became my teacher. My research for this book began when I met her on his introduction. He wrote a book in which he collected what he considered to be the authentic, possibly the easiest to authenticate poems of Tahra Qurat'ul-Ain that come to just about 60. And in this book, A Portrait in Poetry, he writes in the introduction, her short and tumultuous life, the beleaguered circumstances of the Babi community, the clandestine handling of Babi manuscripts, the scattering of her possessions, the hostility of her immediate family, who may have destroyed or suppressed her papers, all these mitigate against any sense of assurance that we now have access to all that she wrote. So we have a subject here whose personal life is very hazy, about whom written documentation is very untrustworthy and mainly censored and suppressed and lost. So I came to the conclusion that there was very little I could go on to actually write a substantial biography, quite apart from the fact that I'm a liar and a writer of fiction and not a historian. I believe that we can look forward to a definitive, perhaps, biography of Tahra Qurat'ul-Ain written by Professor Abbas Amonat in the hopefully not so distant future. But before then, and this is before then, and this is even, I wrote this book before another very important event, which was the placing online of a virtual library by a brilliant scholar of Qajar, Iran, Professor Afsaneh Najmabadi of Harvard University, which is called Women's Worlds in Qajar, Iran. And on that website you can find the most extraordinary documents and artifacts and materials that illustrate what life was like in Qajar, Iran. I wrote my book before having had the privilege of access to such a site, so I was literally in the dark and in my own fictions. And I came to the conclusion that the only way I could approach it was by writing a fiction. You must surely have heard of the name of Hilary Mantel, one of the great writers of our times, who has written the two massive tomes based on Tudor history, called Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. She's received the Booker Prize twice. She is truly a magician with words and is a very great historical novelist. And in her analysis of what it takes to write a novel about history, she says, the truth is always best if you can get at it. But she also adds, my method is to wrap fiction around the documented record, to let the imagination lead us by touch into the rooms where history cannot shine a light. I thought that was a luminous way of describing my own blind fumblings in the dark of Persian Qajar history. But she's talking about a period which is massively documented. Everybody knows about Henry VIII and his 6 wives and which ones he cut the heads off. So, I mean, this has been written about ad infinitum. We've got an entire library, the Folger Library, which fills our minds with all the documentary evidence around that period. But what do normal, ordinary people on the street know about Qajar Iran? Hilary Mantel is depending on the knowledge of her readers of a period of history so that she can then wrap her fiction around that hard core of well-known documented knowledge. But I had to do the opposite. I had to sort of wrap around a core of fiction. I had to look for tiny traces of documented fact, and the fiction at the core of all of this was much larger than the documentation. I call it fiction because it's much of the information we have is personal records which sometimes cannot be authenticated. So, and people have notions of Tahira Qurat'ul-Ain in the extremes. They consider her to be a saint, they consider her to be a prostitute, they think she emancipated women, they think she was a heretic who violated Islam. So we have a multiple vision of this woman who created such an uproar in her times. And I have to say that whenever, and this can happen at any time, in any place, and about anyone, whenever there is trauma, whenever there is collective agony experienced by a people, which I believe is what happened in the middle of the 19th century to the people of Iran. There was an upheaval in Iran during this period of the Babi dispensation. People were killed in their tens of thousands. They were bloodily massacred. There were polemics of the two extremes for and against the Babi faith. And at such a time when that kind of trauma takes place, it leaves scars. It leaves shadows, it leaves confusion. And when we have that experience, we find many contradictory concepts being circulated. You know, I come from the eastern borderlands of France, which were German before Napoleon I took them over, which then became German when the Kaiser took them over in 1871, which then became French again with the Treaty of Versailles when the Germans lost the First World War, which then became German again when Hitler crossed the Rhine. And the peoples of this area, the Alsatians, have a very complicated sense of who they are. You have concepts about them that they have of themselves and that the French have of them. The French have called them traditionally the Boche, as if they were German traitors. Remember, this is an area which was also where Alfred Dreyfus came from. So the French, of course, think of them as turncoats and have rejected them as going towards the German side. And the Germans do the same. They have treated them as just wimpy French guys who, you know, ended up not having enough spine to be proper Germans. So they themselves have recently, well, since the end of the Second World War, reinvented themselves as well. And they call themselves the malgré nous. And they see themselves as the victims of both sides. A plague on both your houses. They've decided to be European at the end of the day, and they've established one of the centers of the European Union in Strasbourg. But in order to get a sense of how that might be relevant to the subject of tonight, I discovered a very interesting quotation by a man called Laird Boswell, who was writing about the people of Alsace. And it seemed to me he was almost writing also about Iran in Qajar times, and also even now. He was writing about how we perceive Tahirih from our perspective now and how she was perceived in her times. He says, which past, after all, does one need to address and come to terms with? One of collaboration or accommodation? One of courageous civil disobedience or of simple adaptation? One of implicit complicity or one that highlights the courage of individuals who take a stand? Clearly, it is not an either-or proposition. I thought that was a very interesting remark because I think that's how I felt I needed to approach this heritage of contradictory, controversial information that we have about Tahirih. This brilliant woman, trained in logic, who apparently was so extremist that she might have been considered today a fundamentalist. A woman who had so much vision of the future that she could see the need for change 150 years before what we have in the what's happening in the Islamic world today. And at the same time, a woman who apparently left her children, abandoned them, divorced her husband. What kind of a woman is that? So I decided to look at her from multiple perspectives in order to try to capture some of those multiple lives. There's a recent biography that has just been written by a woman called Anne Skur, and it's about John Aubrey, the marvelous little man who, I don't know why I call him little, it's because he wrote in tiny amounts. If you read his brief lives, they're only a paragraph long sometimes, a contemporary of Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, and his brief lives sum up the lives of these great characters in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries, and she has reconstructed his life by using his words. And in the review about this marvelous book, I read the following: our actual lives are singular. This is the review of the Times Literary Supplement speaking about the new biography of John Aubrey. Our actual lives are singular to ourselves, but our afterlives are necessarily plural. Memory is always reconstructive. The ambiguity and unfinishedness of all life only serves to obscure the fallacy that there might be any person at any time or in any place whose life might be told in only one way. So I decided to tell the life of Tahirih in at least 4 ways. And I chose 4 women who have their historical counterparts in Qajar, Iran: the mother of the Shah, Mahta Awliya, the sister of the Shah, Izzatul Sultaneh, the wife, I call her Mrs. Mahmud Khan, the Kalantar, the wife, because she didn't have a name, it hasn't survived history, and so many women were known either according to who their father was, who their son is. My own grandfather in the graveyard in Akka is known as al-Ha. She is the mother of Ha. She didn't have a name. So this woman, the wife of the Kalantar, has come down to us in history, from history, without a name, Mrs. Mahmud Khan. And we have the daughter of Tahirih herself. Just to give you some idea of the ambiguity surrounding this child, the most sentimental versions of her, we're told that Tahirih had 3 children. In one source I found 4, and then that was contradicted back to 3. So I mean, there's a ping-pong game even going on about her children, but we know she had 2 sons and 1 daughter for sure. And the one daughter in the sentimental version of her life died of a broken heart after Tahirih was killed. But in another version of her life, which is probably more accurate, she survived to a ripe old age. She lived on, had children, got married herself, and went back to Qazvin and taught herself in those same schools. In other words, she followed in her mother's footsteps. But to the last day of her life, she insisted that her mother died as a devout Muslim. Now, that kind of contradiction and confusion is partly what I made my meat out of. I just wanted to read to you a little glimpse, if I can find it, of the way in which I filled the gaps that I discovered. Partly you have contradictions, and as a result of those, you have gaps. And partly you have, gaps. So partly contradictions, partly gaps. And in the gaps, I had to invent. I'm going to read to you just a very brief paragraph about a little story that we have about Tahireh and her rings. We know that she had 3 rings, according to the Mrs. Mahmud Khan. And I wrote the following about the rings. A woman's jewels always tell a story. If she buys herself rings, she must either use her dowry to do so or find the money elsewhere, and her husband would soon learn of the source. If she receives them as a gift, she would have to explain the reasons for such generosity, and he would soon discover the giver. And if she earns them by her own means, which was the worst of all, she would have to justify the method she had used to do so. There is space enough to slip the finger of imagination into the smallest band of silver or of gold. Lick a ring, and you can taste the sweat and smell the blood in a woman's life. Bite it, and you can see the marks of her teeth on it, see where it was worn thin with rubbing. The simplest ring contains 1,000 associations. And so I think it was with Tahireh. The smallest details that we have about her give us 1,000 potential ways of interpreting the story. I told you about the 4 points of view through which I tried to see Tahireh, either from a mother's point of view or a wife's point of view, a sister's point of view or a daughter's point of view, because she herself was wife, mother, sister and daughter, but none of the above. She broke all those roles. She violated all the norms. She was a mother without being the classic mother. She was a wife and had the audacity herself to divorce her husband, which is completely against Islamic law. She was a sister and was probably absolutely unbearable because she knew too much, read too much, said too much, imposed herself probably on the family too much. And therefore, she wasn't the kind of Persian woman she should have been. Certainly, as a daughter, she violated the expectations of her family. And I thought maybe I could read to you. Is it all right that I read to you? Yes. I'll read to you another little bit, which is a reflection on the relationship that she had with her father. When Tahireh escapes from her father's home, he had only placed her in it to protect her because members of her own family had attempted twice to poison her. And he knew very well that if she went out onto the streets, the rabble in Qazvin, because the city was divided, those that were for and those that were against her, not only the family, but the city, not only the city, but the country had been divided by the ideas of the Bab. He was afraid for her life, so he kept her locked up in the house. But for a woman like Tahireh, and again I quote you, dearest Farzaneh, for whom mobility not only of the mind and the spirit, but also of the body, to be free to come and go. From a young age she had travelled out of Iran and gone to Karbala. She had spent all those years away from this narrow little provincial town of Qazvin. She then went to Baghdad. She travelled with a retinue of Kurds. She was out there in the open air. When she went to that famous or infamous conference of Badasht, once again, she was mobile. And to be trapped in this house must have been hell for her. She was unusual as a woman because she had a library. So she was able, in a sense, to wander in her mind and spirit. But when she finally escapes, I've written the scene of what her father discovers in the library. How empty the library was after her going. Her father stayed in there, touching the spines of the books, caressing the pages she used to read to him. He lingered the whole day in there after her escape, murmuring, weeping. How he missed the sound of her voice, her chanting. How he deplored the silence in the Anderun. She had taken her pen case with her and her reeds, but it was only after several hours had passed that he noticed the gaps on the shelves. She had chosen carefully. She had selected only the most important to her, and the spaces where the books used to be mocked him, teased him with his ignorance. He had the impression that if he could only remember which ones she had chosen, he might be able to trace where she had gone. But try as he might, he couldn't summon those texts to memory, nor retain why it was that they'd been so important to his daughter. He recalled their passionate arguments about them. He remembered their differing interpretations of them. But the substance of the books, which were the pivot of their talks, eluded him. He realized that those gaps on the library shelves bore witness to his greatest loss of all. For without the knowledge of what had once lain on them, the mind, as well as the body of his beloved daughter, had slipped between his fingers. Well, as we were saying, daughters, mothers, sisters, wives, the whole family, perceptions of Tahirih from these different points of view. I must tell you that it wasn't only from the women's points of view that I tried to define who this enigma was. I also looked through the point of view of several men. And each one of the 4 books which are inside this book, don't look at this cover because it's only the galleys, the book of the mother, the book of the sister, the book of the wife, and the book of the daughter, begins with the death of a man. Because the men in Tahirih's life are incredibly important. And I've just read to you the mental voice, if you like, of one of the most important men in her life, and that was her father. He was instrumental to make her who she was. But the other men in her existence were also very important. We have the Shah, we have the mayor of Tehran, the Kalantar, we have Amir Kabir, the great prime minister, and we also have her own uncle, who was her father-in-law, Mullah Muhammad Taqi Barqani. And these men are very much part of my story. I don't give them names, I give them their roles of power: mayor, monarch, minister, and mullah. And they cover the 4 areas of power in Qajar society. And I needed to look from all their perspectives in order to see her better. And I went one step further to try to see her from different perspectives by also looking from the perspective of an outsider. Because there were several outsiders in this story. There was the outsider who was the wife of the British ambassador, who was the woman who first mentions the name of Tahirih in English in 1856 when she describes the massacres and she refers to Tahirih Qurat'ul-Ain by name. How much time do we have? I'll just read you quickly what she says, because it's interesting, because I have to get to the lies. I've told you about women, I've made a mention of men, but we have to get to those lies, right? So, this is what Lady Mary Shields says about Tahirih. There was still another victim. This was a young woman, the daughter of a mullah in Mazandaran. Not true. Who, as well as her father, had adopted the tenets of the Bab. Not true. The Babis venerated her as a prophetess. True. They venerated her as a seer, as a predictor, as a visionary of the future. I'll get to that. We're going to have a debate, I can see. And she was styled the Qurat'ul-Ain, which Arabic words are said to mean pupil of the eye. True, right? We give it ticks to Miss Lady Mary Shield. We'll see whether she passes the test at the end. After the Babi insurrection had been subdued in the above province, referring to Mazandaran, and she's talking about Sheikh Ahmed, Sheikh Tabarsi, which is not the time when this happened, so her timing is wrong, because it was not after they had been subdued. She was brought to Tehran, that's true, and imprisoned, but was well treated. Partially true, not entirely true, not in the beginning. When these executions took place, now we come back to the present moment, which for her was 1852, and she's describing the massacres in Tehran, she was strangled. It was a cruel and useless deed. I did this kind of analysis with this statement of Lady Mary Shiel in order to test to see where she was getting her facts. And when I realized she was not giving accurate information entirely, I realized, well, where would she have got it from? There were only two possible sources. One was her husband, and the other was the women in the women's part of the building, because she learned Persian during her 3.5 years in Iran. She learned Persian so that she could communicate with the nannies and the wet nurses of her children. So she had these two sources. Now, her husband was the British ambassador, if you please, and he filled 1/3 of the book that she published when she came back to London with his notes. So, I mean, he certainly believed in his scholarship and his authentic information. You can say, well, did he get all his facts right? Who was he depending on to get the information? But when we look at the other source of the information she might have got it from, then I introduced another source of point of view in my story, which was gossip, rumor and gossip. And so in this book, you have several characters all giving you their points of view, and you also have a collective character who is a Greek chorus of women gossips. And they are fantastic because they can tell you every extreme under the sun, and they believe entirely in what they're saying, and they exaggerate it because, I mean, it's fun making exaggeration. So I have them spill out all these paradoxes that we have inherited from history, and they are a very valuable informant in the story. But to get back to my outsiders for a minute, it wasn't only the foreigner who was the outsider. There was also another one, and I really can't resist but read you a teeny tiny possible description of how I describe the sister of the Shah. Now, the sister of the Shah was based, as I said, on a historical figure, and when you look at what there is available about her, it's quite a sad story. She was basically used as a political tool by her brother and was married off on several occasions. And without going into the actual historical data, I have summed up her fate in this paragraph. They called her the polo ball. By the way, you can see a picture of her on the internet. They called her a polo ball, even before she was sent hurtling across the muddy field of ministerial politics. She looked just like one, according to the women of the royal Anderoon, so it was hardly surprising that the Shah passed her back and forth with a crack of his muddy mallet from one marriage to the next in the following 5 decades. She was wed to his first, to the son of his second, to the brother and the nephew of his third and fourth, and finally to the secretary of his 5th premier. But her value dropped steadily with each alliance. Although she served as the king's seal of approval when newly minted, her currency became worthless when accompanied by his disfavor. Her first marriage was doomed to death, her second to divorce, her third to disease, her fourth to disappointment, and her 5th to disgrace. By the time her brother was assassinated, it had become evident that whoever married his sister would suffer castration or eradication in the end. Here is a woman who truly was an outsider. Although she was right at the heart of the Qajar court, although she was being used for political purposes, you get the feeling, listening to her life, that she was always an outsider, psychologically, emotionally. She had no identity of her own, and she was peripheral to anything significant for her own life. She had no agency. So these were some of the characters that I used to look at Tahirih from from outside as well as inside. And the last one I wanted to mention was not only collective, not only outsider, not only the roles of women, but a woman who I used to come in and out of the story all the way through, who we see as a wet nurse, who we see as a nanny, who we see as a midwife, and finally who we meet as a corpse washer, a washer of corpses. A corpse washer, it's an interesting role because it's also sex segregated. You have to, if you're going to die and you're a woman, you can only be washed by a woman. And if you're a woman corpse washer, you can't wash any men. So here is a story of a woman who is a corpse washer who ends up being something of the inheritor of Tahir's legacy in my story, the legacy of the poetess. And I have described her as nobody's sister, nobody's mother, and nobody's wife. But I must have been Time's daughter, for it seemed I'd been standing at that gate forever. One has to read forwards and backwards simultaneously in such situations. Now, I want to just describe why I've chosen this corpse washer. When we read history, we're looking back, retrospective time. I'm going to get to this with Farzana after the meeting, but when we look forward and we anticipate the future, which she did by saying to her uncle when he was cursing Sheikh Ahmad Asai, "Oh, uncle, I see your mouth filled with blood." So that when the mullah was found murdered in the mosque, they accused her of masterminding the murder because they said, you see, she planned it. She knew it. She knew it was going to happen. Therefore, she made it happen. And when she said to the mayor, the Kalantar, the master whom you serve will one day betray you, and 10 years later, indeed, he was strung up and hung and quartered and humiliated before the whole city for his corruption by the Shah, who needed a scapegoat at the time. Everybody said, you remember? She said this was going to happen. That rumor was going around to such a degree that it even lasted, that would have happened 10 years after she mentioned it. So we're talking about when she said it would have been 1848, 49, and now we're talking about 10 years later, 1859, 60. When Count Gobineau came to Iran, to Persia, he heard that rumor being spread around. It was still in people's ears. So this notion that she could read the future is the reason why I used anticipatory time in this story. And I'll get to the corpse washer in a minute because she's rather important, but I just want to introduce a little digression here about anticipatory time. Going back to Hilary Mantel, when everybody knows history, then you don't have to play the game with suspending disbelief. Let me explain myself. Coleridge said that the greatest of art required the suspension of disbelief. That means you have to sort of shut your eyes and say, well, I know it's not really true, but oh boy, maybe it is. And you allow yourself to believe in something you know is not a reality. That is the basis of our imaginative escape when we watch films, when we read books, when we do anything that involves the engagement of the mind. Now, I believe we can also do the same thing, and we do the same thing with time. And when Hilary Mantel describes the need to shut your eyes, and she does it in a passage which I can't now find, so never mind, she says we have to go back and imagine that we are Thomas Cromwell and we don't know that our head is going to be cut off. Of course, as readers, we know very well. We know very well that Anne Boleyn is going to have her head rolling in about 2 years' time. But she writes in such a way that we can suspend our disbelief in the fact of the future and engage in that moment. Now, it becomes very difficult to do that with a history which nobody knows. There's no fun in pretending that you don't know what's going to happen when you don't know what's going to happen. So you need to play with time. So I had to use this jumping form of chronology going forward into the future, coming back, giving the reader a little glimpse of what would happen in order to give the reader the game of forgetting it by getting into the minds of the present at that point in history. So, retrospective time and anticipatory time. That's what the corpse washer means when she says you have to read forwards and backwards simultaneously. She's reading corpses. She's reading bodies. And she talks about bodies the way I talk about a text. So she says, corpses and books are a contradictory lot. Their vulnerability is heartrending, their detachment infuriating. They never acknowledge attention, never admit gratitude. We're talking about books here and corpses. But you would be hard-pressed to find such humility among the living. I think I have to stop soon, don't I? One last lie. This brings us straight back to the corpse washer. The reason I wrote this book was because I came across a really good lie, and it was uttered by a Persian woman. It was the lie that was voiced by the wife of the Kalantar when she admits to the prediction of Tahirih. She sees it as a prediction. In fact, I think it was just a plan. But Tahirih has told her that 3 days after the soldiers come to take her away, a woman will come to the door and she should give her a package. Now, of course, it was probably a bokche, not a package. It was wrapped in cloth. The things you wrap in cloth are precious. If the cloth is really precious, then they are doubly precious. Now, we don't know what was in that bokche, that bundle, that package. The wife of the Kalantar does not tell us. What she says is that in fact 3 days after she was taken away, a woman did come to the door. And you get the feeling she's telling you that to, you see, she was a prophetess. But in fact, what she's also saying is, immediately afterwards, I'd never seen her before and I never saw her again. I never saw her before, that woman who came to the door, and I never saw her again. And when I read those words, granted, they're in English, which is a lie in itself, right? For anyone who's a good Persian speaker, why write in English? So, why is she saying that? And when I thought about it more and more, and I slipped the finger of imagination into that particular ring, I realized that that package did contain something not only precious, but dangerous. So dangerous that the wife of the mayor did not want to have anything to do with the woman who came to take it. Now, we can also think and understand that if Tahirih has told her that a woman will come to the door, give her this package, she is protecting the wife of the mayor, because she knows very well that if those, whatever they are found on the premises of the wife of the mayor, then that poor woman has not got a day left alive. So she was possibly protecting her, but she was definitely protecting what was in that package, in that bundle. It was so precious that she wanted to preserve it. And I started by speaking to you about the difficulty of finding out about her life. So really, I have to leave you to imagine what was in that bundle. But it was the basis on which I made my own bundle of little 4 books in one book. And thank you very much for listening to all my lies. That's it.